It's nice to be here talking about leadership because it's one of the great stupidities of management consultancy. Sorry about this, but I'm not going to be taking prisoners if I've only got 20 minutes. I haven't got time to be nice about this. I use this slide at a lot of conferences because there's this fundamental belief if you only had inspired leaders with the proper training, somewhere or other magically everything would work, right? And it just ain't the case. And one of the things I'm going to be arguing as I go through this is we need to stop thinking about individual leadership and think about collective leadership. And that doesn't mean some sort of new age fluffy bunny all bonding together and servant leadership, but I'll come back to that one. It actually means a degree of discipline. If you look at military environments, leadership is always distributed into crews. If you look at, there's always a pilot on the plane, but who the pilot is can actually change. So one of the things we're working on at the moment is to actually introduce crews into organizations, because that way you can have cognitive diversity, educational diversity, and leadership isn't an individual act. And the problem we got at the moment, certainly in American management, is that you either have rigid processes. Remember business process reengineering? And then after that, we got what we fondly call Six Sigma. Anybody come across Six Sigma yet? Yeah, business process reengineering with the worst aspects of Bible Belt fundamentalism added onto it for good measure, right? Yeah, it's a cult, and the leaders of the cult get black belts. Yeah, they're exempt from doing any real work so that actually they can monitor the other guys. It's actually been abandoned in companies like 3M because it destroys the capacity to innovate. So you either have these very rigid process-based approaches which nothing can escape, and everything else is left to the inspired leader. Yeah? And then you get people writing books about the qualities of leaders. And of course, they have to accommodate every leader there has. Now, how you put Steve Jobs in the same category as nearly any other industrial leader, I don't know, but they do their best to try. And I speak as somebody who's had a pile of books thrown at him by Steve Jobs. I'm quite proud of that one, right? But his management style was completely different from, say, General Electric or any of those other companies. There isn't a general model of leadership that you can follow. Yeah? Leadership is not context-free, it's context-specific. And some of the programs I ran when I was IBM was to throw senior leaders in IBM, this is the top 300, into Yonkers and parts of New York to actually act as janitors and cleaners for a week to identify natural leaders within the community and realize that leadership is a property of the way you interact with people, not a property of status or training. Yeah, and that's the other problem. I call it the tyranny of the explicit. We know from multiple research that 70% of learning is based on informal networks, 20% based on experience, and 10% based on formal training. So that rather implies the money spent on leadership training is probably a waste of time proportionate to managing the other things. Managing and creating informal networks, something we're working on with Valdez Krebs and the like, i.e. managing the resilience of the organization by increasing the density of informal networks, is far more effective than formal learning or training programs. And that's kind of like a general theme I'm going to draw on here, is leadership is generally about creating the right context for good things to happen. Yeah, that's kind of like a broad principle. Okay, now the first thing that we need to learn as a leader is the concept of coherence. So I thought I'd give you an illustration of coherence. This is my study, a picture taken 4 or 5 days ago. As you can see, the master of the household is sat in the chair. I had been sitting in that chair for some time previously, but she marched in, looked at me, and I know what I have to do. I pressed the button on the desk which takes it to vertical status, vacated the chair, and after a period of time I was told to stop stroking her and get on with some work. All right? We'll come back to cats later. Right? Cats have servants, dogs have masters is the general phrase. Now, my study is a bit of a mess at the moment because even though I've built new book corridors, I've run out of space for books. So there are piles of books, and every now and then my wife objects to me cluttering the kitchen table with piles of papers I brought back from conferences. So as you can see, there are boxes of there. I can find anything in that pile instantly. Yeah? Coherence actually doesn't have to be neat and tidy and structured. Mess can be coherent. Yeah? And the concept of coherence is a key one in philosophy of science. And if anybody's offended by this, I do not apologize. You need to get an education, right? We know that evolutionary theory is wrong because we keep discovering new things. But current theory is coherent to the facts. So it's a pathway worth pursuing. Young age creationism, on the other hand, is incoherent to facts and should be dismissed. Now, coherence is a key concept in modern management. Have you got a coherent pathway doesn't have to be a factual pathway or a true pathway. Yeah, one of the ways you manage uncertainty is not to try and reduce or get rid of the uncertainty, but to identify pathways through uncertainty which have sufficient coherence to justify how you work through them. And I haven't got time on this now, but there are ways to measure and test for coherence on experiments. We don't just let anything go. So coherence is a first and key concept. Second one is the whole issue of complexity. Now that's a 3-day course in its own right. The essence to understand a complex adaptive system is that there is no causality. There is no linear relationship between causality. Everything in complexity is context specific. The thing which worked for you perfectly 3 hours ago may not work now if the context has changed. Yeah, complex systems are dispositional, not causal, which means you can actually make the context more favorable to what you want, but you can't actually make it happen. There's a key concept here, it's called constructor theory in physics. It's one of the first theories in physics, came out of Cambridge University, which tries to deal with physics, with the physical system as a whole, rather than reducing it to small parts. What it basically says is also the concept of constraints, is that natural law provides a constraint, so the laws of gravity apply, but it's cheaper to build a satellite than to create another moon. Yeah, the concept here is everything is subject to the laws of gravity, but whatever has the lowest energy gradient will happen. Now that's a key concept in management. If the energy gradient is high, i.e. the informal networks don't like what you want to do, it ain't going to happen. Yeah, part of the problem we got with populism in politics is the energy gradient of following a Trump or a Boris is lower than the energy gradient of discrimination or knowledge or understanding in society. So we have to learn to manage those energy gradients and stop taking causal models. And there are many implications of that. So I didn't tap the slide. The third one is get real about cognition. Now, how many people have tried to reduce cognitive bias or been told to do it in training? Okay, you need to stop. There's no such thing as cognitive bias. There are only cognitive heuristics. Evolution doesn't throw out things which have lack of utility. So-called cognitive biases are to reduce the cost of information processing. Yeah, and therefore you're not going to be able to change them. If you want to reduce bias completely, you end up with a community of autistics who won't be able to operate. Yeah, we've developed all sorts of shortcuts and what the biases are. So, for example, the one we reference a lot is inattentional blindness. Right? If you give a batch of X-rays to a radiologist, you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists won't see it, even though their eyes scan it. Now, trying to train them not to is a mistake. That's reality. So once you realize that reality, you start to build decision support systems which basically find the 17% who are seeing the gorilla before they talk to the other people. Once you realize that that's a part of what it is to be human, you stop trying to train people not to do it. You start to build systems and processes which work with the way we evolved rather than the way we might like to design ourselves if we started from scratch. Yeah? So understanding the basics of human cognition is key because human beings evolved to make a decision in a certain way. And part of the problem we got with AI is people are trying to make humans poor quality information processors. Yeah, we do not process data the way a computer processes data. We process it in a radically different way. Yeah, the training data set issue with AI is very scary at the moment because effectively most AI algorithms and be written by young males who've never seen a female who think Ayn Rand should be taken seriously after puberty, right? And I'm being quite serious there. The actual bias of the people generating the AI is actually being built into the AI. And if we don't do something about it, we've got a problem. As I famously said once in Santa Fe, carbon isn't silicon. And if you know your Star Trek, you know that silicon life forms are very different. But that's the HOTA. You either know that one or you don't. So those are three key. It's kind of like 3 C's, all right? You have to keep thinking about those because they have consequences for the way you work. Yeah? As I say, the cat theme is there. These also contradict the dominant systems thinking which has dominated the last 3 decades. Part of the problem, and this is controversial in some cases, I had the privilege to teach leadership with Peter Drucker. And that was after I was totally humiliated in a conference, which I will never forget. If you're criticized by a 93-year-old genius after you've just given what you thought was a really good keynote, all right, you end up as a puddle of humiliation on the stage in the Hotel Del in San Diego. But he decided I was redeemable, so took me out for dinner, and then we ran a series of masterclasses together. One of the conclusions we came to is that scientific management, which is much decried, had more in common with complexity thinking than either did with systems thinking. Because if you look at what scientific management did from the 1920s to the 1980s, it automated what could be automated, but it still assumed an apprentice model of leadership. People joined companies for life. They learned to work with each other. They promoted within. Yeah, so the concept of human judgment was a key part of systems thinking. Of scientific management. What happened when systems thinking came in is the metaphor became, and it was a military metaphor which underpinned it. And the military would never abandon the concept of human judgment and learning through experience. We then replaced it with an engineering metaphor. And then we ended up with people effectively doing BAs in business studies, MBAs, joining a large consultancy firm, and moving sideways to manage companies with no experience whatsoever except management through numbers. What systems thinking has done for the last 30 years is attempt to eliminate human judgment from the whole process. Yeah, spreadsheet-based management. So one of the things we're now interested in is modern apprenticeships. Yeah, how do we diversify people's experience? It takes you 2 or 3 years for your body and brain to co-evolve around any knowledge base, and that's a scientific fact. You can't just acquire it from a book. You have to live the experience. Yeah, knowledge is largely embodied, yeah, and embedded in the way we work. So, some heresies that come out of that. Sorry, I'm an ex-Jesuit and a former Catholic, and I have a Huguenot ancestry wife, and her ancestors can't understand why she married a Catholic, because for some reason they resent the fact we burnt a large amount of them in the Middle Ages, all right? So I've been overcoming that for years. But the concept of heresy is an important one, right? The idea that everything goes is a mistake. Yeah, I get really annoyed with this in workshops. People say all opinions are equally valid. Well, sorry, they're not. Yeah, that's kind of like the populist argument. Yeah, postmodernism is responsible for Trump. Because it basically said there is no factual base for making judgment. Well, if that's the case, anything goes. Yeah, so some of the popular ones in management at the moment. Yeah? The first one is categorization. And I hesitate to say this because you kind of like did a categorization in your exercise earlier. The desire to put things into boxes. And the danger with categorization is boundary conditions. So you're okay in the center of a category, but when things fit on a boundary, they don't fit. And you can make really bad decisions. But categorization is huge. Things like Myers-Briggs. Anybody done Myers-Briggs? Right, it's established as a pseudoscience. There is no scientific basis for it whatsoever. In fact, it contradicts everything we know about human cognition. But it puts people into little boxes, so it's a lot of fun. Yeah, I mean, I use astrology as an alternative, because at least people, and I do it as an alternative. Everybody in Cognitive Edge knows which Harry Potter school class they belong to, right? Because making differences so you talk about differences is valuable. Thinking they're serious is stupid. Right? So categorization is a danger. The next one is Manichaeism. This is probably the biggest of all of them, which is why I've shown you a picture of the Albigensian Crusade. The Manichaean theology basically says everything on the earth is evil and you have to get to heaven because that's where everything is good. There are, and I hesitate to use this phrase these days, no shades of grey between black and white. Yeah? And how many of you have seen tables which say on the left is the bad things that are in the past and on the right are all the really good things we're going to do now? Anybody seen those? Yeah, anything like that should be wiped from the face of the earth. Yeah, because fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with rigid processes in manufacturing design around nuclear power control. Yeah, everything is right or wrong within context, and that's the key thing. And what you see this with the Agile community at the moment, they're trying to say all this stuff was bad, therefore we must be right. Now that's a classic power trip, all right? You attack other people, and then the assumption is you must be right because you've proved they're wrong. And that's just not the case. And you've all seen this, we're agile, we're non-agile, we're not scientific. Anything which is a two-column table has to be treated with danger, right? And it's a long-standing tradition in humans. Homogenization. This is kind of like the opposite side of this, is not recognizing that you need differences within the system. Now, you don't need to be rigid differences, but you have to have diversity. One of the real dangers on this, by the way, is having everybody aligned around common values and beliefs and with common goals. That's a recipe for total disaster in any human system, because you've destroyed diversity in the system, or you've got diversity with heavy game playing as people try and pretend they're following your value system. I had this argument with Peter Senge once. I said, you will never, ever get everybody with a common value and a common alignment. They'll pretend they're doing it because they play the corporate game. And the good news is you can't get it, because if you ever did, the organization would lack requisite diversity, it would not be resilient, and it would die the minute the context shifted. Yeah, you need coherence around diversity. Yeah, you don't actually need active conflict, but you have to have vast diversity within the system. KPIs. All the available research, you can have the reference since you want, says when people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. There is no scientific valid research to deny that. Where do we have the highest number of explicit goals? Health, education, and social work. Where do we need the highest need of intrinsic motivation? Health, education, and social work. Yeah, KPIs destroy intrinsic motivation. They prevent empathy. I got a standing ovation at a nurses' conference recently when I said, and I asked if I could be honest, I said, every one of you breaks the rules every day to provide empathetic care to patients. Yeah, you find this with social workers as well. The rules are designed for a context-free world. They live in a context-specific world, and if they care about people, they have to break the rules and gain the targets. Yeah, there's other ways to deal with that we should focus on. Grand plans. Yeah, this is the complete reorganization. Don't worry, guys, we'll all get together, throw out what we did in the past. We'll have 500 management consultants in for 2 years, and we'll have a wonderful vision of the future. Anybody in the Agile movement? Yeah, this is safe. Yeah, kind of like, don't worry, everything will be all right when we change everything. It's also the problem with global warming at the moment. We keep actually having these scary stuff from journalists, and it's bloody scary. I know enough about the science. But the way we're reporting the dangers of global warming at the moment disables ordinary people from action. They can't see anything they can do, so they just turn off. We've been doing projects on finding small things that people can do to realize they can make a difference. Yeah, and the same is true in organization. Grand plans and mass reorganizations are disaster management processes, not day-to-day management processes. But the reality is they're used to avoid taking responsibility from the present. If you say we're going to do X, Y, Z, and the consultants encourage this, so everything will be okay in a year or 2 years' time, you avoid taking responsibility for doing something here and now. Yeah, small things are more likely to impact the future than large things, but they have to be managed in a coherent fashion. Power games. This, by the way, is a real danger for facilitators. We've actually got several processes where we don't allow facilitators into it. So some of the change processes we have in communities, you don't want external facilitators there because, to use a crude British phrase, they get their rocks off in enabling the process. They don't want people to tell their own stories, they want to elicit those stories. Yeah, and power is a key aspect of our work on distributed ethnography. We give people the power to interpret their own story outside a facilitated context. Or only within a facilitation of their own community, their own network, because that external process is key. And it's interesting because power gets paid in overt ways and covert ways. Power can be actually manipulated for good as well as for evil. Yeah, we've got a problem in the development sector at the moment, yeah, in that you actually get people who say, I have to be there to achieve the change. I call it young white males playing good. I haven't got the quite phrase yet. But they believe they have to be there, otherwise the change won't happen. They don't create the conditions for change. And just by the way, if you look around this audience, we need to be very conscious of power dynamics in terms of social change. Yeah, because, and we found that in the South Wales Valleys, Bethan can tell you about this in the projects, is the way the valleys feel about their life is very different from the way middle-class people in Cardiff feel about their life. And it's about very small, ordinary things without the need for workshops and confession and all goal setting. It's about making, to be honest, I'll give you the example, it's about creating a bike park. You can achieve more social change with a bike park than with multiple workshops if it comes from that community and it's their own idea. And I can go into more examples on that if you want. And finally, we get industrialization. This is what happened with things like appreciative inquiry, if anybody's come across that. Yeah, the original Coupe Rider stuff was really good. It was kind of like we shouldn't always focus on the negative, we need to find a way to focus on the positive. Then it got industrialized into a consultancy method where you're not allowed to tell negative stories, you're only allowed to tell positive stories. And of course, negative stories are the primary learning experience of mankind. Because we tell our story, all fairy stories are stories of failure, because avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. Now, if you look at the original Coupe Rider stuff, it doesn't eliminate that. But as it gets industrialized as a method, and that's the problem, you can see the same with many things, right? The original Agile Manifesto was industrialized. Yeah, the work of Clayton Christian, who I've worked with, yeah? He's a brilliant guy, but it's been industrialized in a consultancy method which permits no deviation from the form. Yeah, so industrialization to scale is a real problem in leadership and management that we need to avoid. So, give you two sets of differences and then I'll finish up. First of all, there are actually things we can manage and things which we have to rely on for emergence. And this is kind of like the key issue. And I'll go through these quickly. Now, the point about the things on the right when they come up is at the moment, systems thinking tries to manage by defining them. And you can't define an outcome in a complex system. You can enable in the conditions under which it might emerge. So on the left-hand side, these are the things you can manage. On the right-hand side, you're monitoring. So, first of all, constraints. Constraints can be permeable, they can be fixed, they can be flexible, they can be dark. We have a whole typology of constraints, and it's much easier to do interventions by saying, I'll make that fixed constraint permeable and see what happens. So the constraints, and remember, constraints are positive as well as negative. Yeah? Everybody got children? Yeah, do you ever actually not have any constraints in the way you bring up children? Yeah, you need some constraints, but management of constraints and then monitoring is one thing you can do. Second, you can introduce catalysts. You do something small, and this time it takes off. Next time it won't. If it takes off and it's good, you put more energy into it. You can't create the condition, the endpoint, but you can catalyze the conditions. So introducing catalysts is key. Granularity of what you deal with. Small things can actually come together in radical ways very differently. Large things don't change much. So if you don't want change, you make things more structured and larger. If you want change, you break things into smaller units and define the interfaces so that they can interact in novel ways. So granularity is a key aspect of complexity management. Engagement. Who's engaged in the problem? You don't necessarily want everybody engaged. You want diversity in the engagement. So again, you can define who's involved in the problem, who you get advice from. Allocation of resources or starvation of resource. You can often achieve more by taking resources away from people than giving it to them, because that creates more innovation. It's a balancing act. Yeah? So actually that allocation of resources is key. Forcing encounter with differences. We've got a technique called ritual descent, which is much copied, but getting people to find or face people who are radically different and see the world in a different way, yeah, or people from different groups, yet managing those encounters is one of the ways that you achieve change. Liminality, key concept, boundary conditions. Yeah, if something's moving between groups or between types, if you can hold it in a state of suspension before it transits, you open up more possibilities. So holding things in suspension, not running too quickly to a conclusion, yet allowing more diversity, that's kind of like liminal management. You manage things in a state of transition for as long as you can before you achieve the change. And then one of the key concepts which we've been working on, which again is a long lecture, this is 2 years of work now, you can create scaffolding around which things emerge. This is the missing component in complexity management. You can't define an exact structure, but you can define a scaffolding and then allow things to emerge around that scaffolding. And that's everything from kind of like, if you want to take examples, there's a type of medical thing now by which you actually put a microcardial trace into the heart, and it actually leaves electrical wires in the heart in the right position. That's a type of scaffolding. Or there's the rigid scaffolding, which means you kind of like worked out where you are. So the first stage in designing a complex system is to decide how uncertain it is, which determines which type of scaffolding you create. You then create the scaffolding, create the interactions around the scaffolding, and allow a sustainable pattern to emerge. And there's lots of natural examples to support that. The things you can't achieve is you can't manage the attractor wells, you can't manage the tropes. I use tropes instead of memes. Tropes are dominant narrative patterns that people can't escape. It's actually where populism relies on it. And you find organizations have their own tropes. They're patterns of language or patterns of talk which you can't divert from because they're too dominant. Yeah, he's chasing me. Identity, trust. Come on, move over. Meaning, judgment. I'll just get them all up. And outcomes. Now, the point about giving you that list is actually what systems thinking has tried to do is to define the right and ignore the left. On complexity, you focus on the left and see what happens on the right. And at all times, you remember that culture is dominant. And the final theme I want to leave you with is this is from Rudyard Kipling. If you haven't read the Just So stories, the cat chooses when it's domesticated and when it's in the wild. Yeah, we need to actually remove the domestication of management and the domestication of leadership and allow more diversity in what we do. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I'm from South Africa, as you can probably hear. I think Fisher and I had a bit of a disagreement in terms of who came the furthest, so we're still sorting that out. I think we need a map to just figure it out. Maybe a little bit about me. I studied meteorology, so I'm a meteorologist by training. And very often people ask me, so how did you come from meteorology to what you're doing now? And then I tend to just ask them, so how many of you work with people? How many of you feel that those people are predictable? Can you see the link between? Okay, cool. So I'm going to, it's not an easy feat following Dave, so I hope you've got some empathy with me. But I wanted to explore just the kind of human aspect when it comes to dealing with complexity, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a practitioner. So I've been working in this field since 2002. It used to be much harder than it is now. I think to a large extent the world is ready now for engaging with complexity. Doesn't make it easy. So what we're finding is, going to the first slide. It's not working. I'm just going to do this. Leaders nowadays, and I want to broaden it, I don't think it's only leaders, are feeling to a large extent unmoored. It's like they've lost their moorings. It's really interesting. Many people, I don't know what your experience is after listening to Dave, but many of the things that we've come to believe are best practices, things that we should be doing, that we've all been taught in MBAs, like KPIs, alignment. I mean, I think alignment is probably the word I hear the most in organizations. Even things like leadership competencies, what it takes to be a good leader, all of those things that we used to feel were the solid ground that we could stand on, it's all being eroded. And this sense of feeling unmoored is something that I'm encountering more and more in the organizations that I work in. And there's a lot of anxiety that goes with that. I have a friend who does a lot of coaching. And the other day, she told me that 2 of her clients who don't know each other, within the space of a week, used basically exactly the same language to express to her how they feel. And these were senior vice presidents in organizations saying to her, we've realized that we're in a position where we need to pay for empathy. And that just really struck me. That is and these are the organizations that we are all working within. So, sorry, this thing is not... One of my favorite quotes, I'll just put it down. One of my favorite quotes is from Diego Espinosa, and it's basically, we've outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants. And if you think about it, there are entire industries that make their money by being certainty merchants for others. Think of the insurance industry. But I think also what we're doing with leaders, and for those of you who work in organizational change, I think very often we're expecting leaders to be certainty merchants for us, or we're putting people who work in organizational change in the position of we want them to also be certainty merchants for us. Just give us some certainty. And this is a really big trap for us to fall into. And I think one of the key things that I've realized is that there's this need to reconnect with our relationship with uncertainty. I think, in the pre-industrialized era when we were living kind of closer to the land, I think more of us had, this, a relationship. We at least understood that uncertainty is just how the world is. So I went back to my roots here. This was me checking what the weather would be like in Malmö so that I knew what to pack. But we kind of try and find certainty everywhere, and that is based in, or it's a symptom, I think, of some really big narratives that we have all collectively bought into. There's this notion of clarity, stability, predictability, those are all good. And ambiguity, volatility, and uncertainty is bad. I don't know, does this resonate with you guys? We might say, that the world is uncertain and, ambiguity, but when it comes right down to it, we kind of bought into this notion of those are the things that we need to get rid of. And if we can get back to stability, clarity, predictability, that's where things are good. And I think these are some dominant narratives that when we enter organizations or when we try and do this work in complexity that we kind of keep running into. And they're quite pervasive. I think one of the key things for me is that just to realize that complexity is neither good nor bad, just is. I always feel, I find it amusing when you read, some of the articles in the Harvard Business Review, for example, that's all around how do you tame complexity? How do you simplify complexity? Have you guys seen those? It's kind of this idea of we just need to get rid of the complexity. Then everything will be great again. And the key thing for me is, this complexity, we all already know how to deal with it. We do it every day. If you live in a city, if you drive a car, if you use public transport, if you're raising children, you all know how to deal with complexity. There's just this really interesting thing that happens that the moment we step over the threshold into our workplaces, we suddenly imagine ourselves in this wonderful, ordered world where we don't apply any of what we already know from the other contexts. So I recently came across the work of Edgar Morin. Is that the right way to say it? I'm not really French, it's not my thing. But I liked what, this notion of we need to go beyond an intellectual understanding of complexity, and we really need to enter into an embodied or a lived complexity. And this is something that I notice in the work that I do as leaders, people, especially, like senior executives, they understand they've got an intellectual understanding of complexity. It is when you actually need to enter into that living the complexity where it gets a bit messier. And so a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to co-author an article with a group of people who work in environmental studies. So they work in social ecological systems. And it's really interesting because those guys have been dealing with complexity for quite a long time. And we created an article, I blogged about it recently as well, where we spoke about, or where we tried to figure out, those of us who've been living in complexity for a long time, what are some of the patterns that we're seeing that we could potentially put out there almost as guideposts for people as they enter into this space of lived complexity. And I just want to highlight a couple. We called them habits of mind. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right term for them, but I find that these are quite universal, but I also think this is not, I don't want you to listen to this through the lens of these are new competencies that you now need to be measuring and setting KPIs for. These are kind of just guideposts. So the first, and this one is really interesting, I think, is we need to learn to discern time and timing. So last year I had the opportunity to attend the first symposium in human complexity in Washington, D.C., and we got to spend some time with Alicia Guerrero. And one of the things that she said that just really struck me was that we need to focus more on what she called temporal constraints. So this idea of context and timing being really important in complexity. And I don't know how many of you have, this, along with the agile movement, we've also kind of seen this experience of organizations who just want to go faster. Have you come across that? We just need to be faster. Everything needs to be faster. And I'm not sure that that is always true. So just a couple of ideas here. I think there's a time to act and a time to wait. This is really hard for many leaders. So just speaking from my context in South Africa, we had a new president that got elected last year, or 2 years ago now. And we have a lot of problems in South Africa with corruption, with people who should have been in prison already. They're calling it, we've got a term for it now called state capture. And when President Ramaphosa was elected, there was immediately this urge from everybody in the country that you need to act. We want to see some decisive action from you immediately. And he hasn't done that. He's kind of taken a very different approach. He's set up all kinds of inquiries, and the pressure for him to act is becoming more and more. And I guess the jury is out on whether what he's done is right or not. But that pressure to just immediately go into action, I think is something that we all experience whenever we engage with complex systems. And I think it's really important to note that sometimes what you need to do is to not act. If you think of a gardening metaphor, if you sow seeds, you need to wait for the seeds to germinate. But what we very often see is this continuous churn in organizations where we do a restructure. I mean, how many of you have gone through restructurings in the last, 6 months, 3 months? So we've got this continuous, you restructure and you don't really allow this new structure to settle and actually come to some fruition before the next one is upon you. So I think learning to wait and to just allow things to emerge is a really crucial skill for us to just to start thinking about. And then there's a time to keep going and a time to let go. Initially I had that there's a time to keep going and a time to let things die. And I think sometimes that's also really difficult, especially if you've invested a lot in this big project and it's not really working, but it's too big to fail. We've got several very corrupt institutions in South Africa now that's deemed too big to fail. But I think sometimes we actually need to understand when the time is right for something to also come to an end. Second one, and Dave has already touched on this, is we really need to be aware of context. In complexity, everything is contingent on context. So here, context, history, and scale matters. I think sometimes we forget that a complex system cannot be disconnected from its history. So knowing that, every time we enter a system, it's a unique context. Even though they might look the same, it's not, no two contexts are the same. We need to consider how things connect and what flows between them. I've become really interested in this notion of flow and how it connects to complexity. But very often we tend to focus on the individual thing, or sometimes the individual leader. So as Dave, one of the things that I tweeted that Dave said was that leadership comes from the interactions with other people, not the individual leader. So we need to pay more attention on how things interact and what flows between them or what can't flow between them. We need to act small and local. Sometimes these big plans and big projects and wanting to change everything and just going system-wide immediately, that is what gets us into trouble. And then we really need to cultivate diverse feedback mechanisms. I think we've very often found ourselves in echo chambers where we just surround ourselves with people who think like us. So we really need to understand that we also need an understanding of the broader context. And we need to make sure that we get input and feedback from people who don't necessarily think exactly like we do. And then the last one, and I think this is probably, one of the more important ones, is to cultivate openness. One of the key sentences that I see many people have highlighted in the Medium post, one of the key sentences is we need to hold our own strong opinions lightly. Which is not to say you can't have strong opinions. I've got several strong opinions of my own. But to hold them lightly so that you're able to engage with others and not just kind of dismiss things out of hand. And what's important here, I think, is to encourage curiosity. I think we can get a long way if we can just let go of judgment and encourage curiosity. It's not to say that I'm going to agree with everything that you're saying, but I can be curious about it. We need to practice humility. I think one of the key things with a complex, whenever you're dealing with a complex, intractable problem, probably the people who have the best ideas in terms of how to influence it are the people closest to it, and very often those are the people on the front lines, or the blue-collar workers, or the people that we don't necessarily always think about first when we want to go to someone for advice. So are you able to learn from virtually anyone? That is a key question. And linked to this is, do you have the humility to try something and fail? You would have heard Dave talk about safe to fail. I think very often our egos won't allow us to make mistakes and to fail. So do we have the humility to see everybody else as co-learners and not necessarily as that you only need to deal with experts, and can we allow ourselves to fail? Valuing diversity. I think this is one of the key things. I think complexity can completely reframe how we look at diversity. So in South Africa, again, I can only speak from my own context, it's almost become it's a very loaded term. And it's become linked to quotas and black economic empowerment and all of those kinds of things. But if you really understand complexity or diversity from a complex perspective, then it is not a problem to solve, it is a strategic asset to nurture. So can we really value diversity? And this is not just surface level diversity, this is also people who think very differently. It's cognitive diversity. And then the last one, and this is very, very difficult for some, is to let go of consensus. One of the things that I learned from Dave is that in complexity, consensus is not necessarily possible, and it's also definitely not desirable. So how many of you guys, in South Africa, I don't know if it's here as well, we've got this idea of management by meeting and management by consensus. And if we can't get consensus and not everybody agrees, we can't move forward. So can we let go of consensus and go into an experimental way of approaching things that if we can't agree, that's actually good because we maintain diversity and we can construct experiments to see who has the most coherent idea, or maybe there are many. But we don't need to get to consensus in order to move. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of in South African organizations is leadership teams who cannot come to consensus. And the anxiety of that is actually paralyzing. So what's happening now is instead of making decisions, one team that I work with for the next year, they're planning 13 initiatives, all with around 10 sub-projects. And when I asked them, so which of these ones are you going to do and which ones are you going to abandon, they said, no, we're doing all of them. Because nobody wanted to be the one that makes the decision to let go of something that may be the wrong thing to let go of. And they keep circling around consensus. So this is a really important one when dealing with complexity. And then I want to end with one of my favorite poems. This is by Antonio Machado. But what really speaks to me is that the middle one. Traveler, there is no path, the path is made by walking. By walking, the path is made, and when you look back, you'll see a road never to be trodden again. And this for me is it's to my mind, the nature of uncertainty. You know, we keep trying to find new ways that we can then turn into recipes that we can keep doing. And I think we need to understand that we're in a space of continuously becoming, continuously learning and unlearning. We may find one coherent pathway through uncertainty, but that's not to say that that is the pathway that we're going to be using next time. So are we able to make peace with provisionality, you know, with things continuously shifting? So these are some of the habits of mind that we externalized, basically just thinking about the work that we do in complexity. I hope that those are useful for you. I use them a lot when engaging with organizations because we keep running into these grand narratives and, you know, I see leaders also, they seem to feel that they don't notice that what's happening is that the external context is changing. They see all of this as an indictment on their leadership. And what I think this is to try and just get them to see that it's not that they've become bad leaders overnight, it's that the context has shifted. And they need to adapt to that context. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonja.